Hello and good morning, everybody. What is up and welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Liz, and today we are starting on our April month of, we're doing something different. We're going to cover some crimes that have influenced some movies. I'm going to do this for the entire month of April. So today we're going to be talking about Alferd Packer. Now, Alferd Packer, his story was taken and there was a musical released about it in 1993 called Cannibal, the Musical. So, who is Alferd Packer? Now, Alferd Packer is known as the Colorado Cannibal. He is an American prospector. He is a self-proclaimed professional wilderness guide who confessed to cannibalism during the winter of 1874. He and 5 other men traveled through the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, and during the peak of the harshest winter, this is when all of this took place. He said that he had abandoned his party and eventually confessed that the party had resorted to forced cannibalism and that the dead members to stay alive because they were lost. He later recanted the story, confessing that he singularly lived off the flesh of his companions during his snowbound state. This is after they had fallen victim to party member Shannon Bell, of which Alfred said he shot in self-defense. So, yes. So, Alfred Grinner Packer was born in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania on January 21st of 1842. This is an oldie. He is one of 3 children born to James Packer and his wife Esther Grinner. By the early 1850s, James moved his family to LaGrange County, Indiana, where he worked as a cabinet maker. Alfred was said to have a bitter relationship with his parents and later moved in his late teens to Minnesota, where he was a shoemaker. So he did serve in the Union Army during the Civil War. He enlisted on April 22nd of 1862 in Winona, Minnesota. He was assigned to the 16th U.S. Infantry Regiment, Company F. He was honorably discharged due to epilepsy. 8 months later, he was discharged 8 months later at Fort Ontario, New York, which I've been to Fort Ontario and it's beautiful. He moved south, and on the 25th of June of 1863, he enlisted in the 8th Iowa Cavalry Regiment, Company C, in Ottumwa, Iowa. He was then discharged at Cleveland, Tennessee. This was on April 22nd of 1864, and he was discharged for the same reason. He suffered from seizures, secondary, it happened because of his condition. And he was reported to having them about every 2 days, which led to his discharge. He then traveled west, and over the next 9 years, he worked at different jobs. These ranged from a hunter, a wagon teamster, a ranch hand, a field worker, but his seizures basically ensured that he would never keep a job for too long. He also worked for a couple of months as a guide, but those who knew him said that this time, him being a guide by no means was his strong point, and he was prone to lose his way all the time. He ended up working in mining-related jobs, drifting from mine to mine, but never found money through the industry. He worked for a short time in the Colorado area as a miner, but he moved to Utah upon having no luck there at all. By all accounts, Alfred was generally disliked and he wasn't trusted by many. And he was recalled by several people as having been known to steal and being very difficult to get along with. So he was known just to be a pathological liar, basically. Yeah. So in November of 1873, about 20 men left the Bingham Canyon mines near Salt Lake City, and they left for goldfields in Breckenridge, Colorado, upon the news that there was a massive strike that was discovered there. So these men were largely strangers to one another and banded together for their fortune in Colorado. Anywho, so there was a man, his name was Bob Mcgrew. He was the one that originally rallied any man willing to follow him. And a member of the original party, his name is George Tracy, he claimed that the men encountered Packer about 25 miles after their starting point near Provo. Packer asked where they were heading, and when he heard that they were in gold country, they were headed for gold country in San Juan Mountains, he said he wanted to join them. He didn't have any money and also lacked adequate supplies, and those men were very like, should we take him? Should we? But he claimed that he was a prospector and a guide and that he knew the San Juan territory very well. His claim gave him a position of worth with them because they knew little or nothing about Colorado's geography. And unfortunately, neither did Alferd because he was a pathological liar. So members of the original party said that he was like, he overstated his experience as being a seasoned guide in the familiar area, even though he fabricated his qualifications altogether. He also reported being without a rifle at the time that the expedition left, and he was only carrying a Colt revolver. So throughout the course of their journey, Alferd was reported as being greedy and with his rations. He was a bit of a beggar, he was lazy, and he was obstinate. He basically fought with one party member most of the time. His name is Frank Miller. And at the time of his first trial, he was characterized as being a whiny fraud. And that his seizures also were made present in this group, and it caused a strain. So the party basically, like, they made less than adequate progress towards their destination, and the winter became a major obstacle for them because the wagon and the horses were being bogged down. And along with the fact that the Mormon trail they were following was heavily snowed over, and it was very indistinguishable. And this forced a lot of men to just rely solely on their compass. So Alfred's inexperience was also beginning to show itself because the party became lost. Their provisions ran out, and the men were reducing to surviving on a considerable length of time on horse feed. And when they were nearing the point where the horses themselves were next to be eaten. So on January 21st of 1874, they came up to an encampment of Chief Irway, known as White Man's Friend, near Montrose, Colorado. And this is within the Uncampager Valley. The men were desperate, and they still approached the camp with great trepidation, and they didn't know how they were going to be received. So although they were reportedly scared some of the Utes away with their appearance, Chief Irway greeted them as welcome guests and supplied them with food and lodging. And they were greatly astonished by this. Like, here's this man being really nice. Like, what? Yeah. He recommended that they postpone their expedition until spring, since they were likely to encounter a dangerous winter. He told them that no Ute would attempt such a journey, and that the chance that it would be a risk at certain death. Chief Irway offered to allow the men to stay with his tribe until winter passed and promised to share all that he and his people had with them. So, Breckenridge was being descended upon by miners all over the country, and the fear of missing out on the riches is what made the men anxious, so they decided to continue on. After a couple of weeks with Chief Irway and his people, the party then discussed leaving. However, it was the beginning of February at this point, and the snow had been so relentless since their arrival, meaning that half of the party was forced to stay with their wagons and horses until spring. 11 men decided to proceed on, and they intended to travel first to Los Pinos Indian Agency, which is the closest outpost to the camp, and proceeded onward to Breckenridge. So the chief saw that there was no changing the men's minds and gave them food for their journey in a safe direction that bypassed the mountains. However, Alferd was in favor of getting the agency through the mountains, stating that it was more direct. 5 of the 11 men adamantly in favor of going the way that was quicker, eventually securing 5 men to follow him. So Oliver D. Lautensizer Lausenheiser. Yeah, Oliver D. Lausenheiser and 4 other men first. They followed the Gunnison River. The party's own journey was besieged by bad weather and freezing temperatures. Although they followed the river, provisions ran out before they reached their destination. They were close to starvation when cowhands with the government cattle camp near Gunnison, Colorado, came upon them by chance and gave them their food and shelter. They remained at the camp until April. So on February 9th, this is when Alfred and the 5 others left for the agency, trying to go through the mountains. So besides Packer, the group was made of Shannon Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, and George Noon, and Israel Swan. So the fact that this group made their departure with their guide has led many researchers to conclude that Alfred's inexperience and overall attitude had become quite taxing to them, and they figured that they were better off without him. So the men in his party had a 75-mile journey ahead of them. The leader of the combined parties, Bob Mcgrew, guided Packer's party along the river route advised by Chief Irway until the horses could not continue. So this is when they unloaded the men's provisions and went back to Irway's camp. The men then continued along the river before Alfred took the party along a path higher up in the San Juan Mountains, disregarding the ominous warning given by Chief Irway. This decision was made because the men barely had enough food to cover 14 days, as it would take 14 days to travel the safest route. They didn't have snowshoes. They had a bare minimum of matches, no flint, no heavy clothing to combat the extreme cold. They went into the mountains with 2 rifles, 1 pistol, a couple of knives, a hatchet, and minimal ammunition. What after this is not known. They have no idea. So, April 16th of 1874, Alfred emerges from the woods alone, and he stumbles across a frozen lake bed to the Los Pinos Indian Agency near Saguache, Colorado, and he has rags latched to his feet. As the men of where he got to sat around the table at the mess hall eating breakfast, the door flung open. Alfred stood before them, begging for food and shelter. He carried with him a rifle, a knife, a steel coffee pot, and a satchel. So they hurried him inside, sat him down at the table, and gave him some food, which he vomited quickly as he ate, because he didn't have any food, so he would just throw it right up, because he wasn't used to that. He said that his digestion was altered as a result of prolonged near starvation. After several shots of whiskey, he related to the men of what happened leading up to Irway's camp, that he had been hired by 5 men to guide them to Breckenridge. He stated that during their journey, he became snowblind and was lagging behind them. Packer also claimed that a member of the party named Israel Swan supplied him with a rifle, and they then abandoned him. He claimed that he was forced to survive on his own and make his way out of the mountains by himself, and that he was in there for a little over 2 months. He didn't look malnourished. He wasn't threadbare. Most wanderers that would come out of the wilderness of the mountains would look probably skeletal, but he didn't. His face was reported looking bloated. He claimed he was broke and sold the Winchester rifle he had in his possession to Major Downer, who was the agency's justice of the peace, for $10. In 2020, that would be $229. So Packer then stayed with the agency for 10 days before he expressed his wishes to go back to Pennsylvania. This is when they headed back to the nearby town of Saguache to buy supplies for his journey. He then reached there, and this is when Alfred made arrangements in a room at Dolan's Saloon. The owner claimed that Packer had spent around $100, which is the equivalent of $2,287 during his stay, and Alfred even offered to lend him $300. So Alfred spent $78 at Otto Mears General Store, and it was claimed that he had several different wallets in his possession. He drank heavily, he became intoxicated, gave conflicting stories, and they were quick to gossip about him because he had an inconsistent story and an endless cash flow that they had no idea where it came from. So, a man named Preston Nutter, he was a member of the party who remained at Array's camp. Now, he arrived there around the same time that two other original party members did. He encountered Alfred at the saloon and he kept drinking and carrying on. So, Preston asked Alfred where the rest of the party is, and this is when Alfred claimed that he had got his feet wet and frozen. He stated that he set up camp when the storm set in. He set up a fire while the others went ahead to look for food. Alfred claimed that Swan left him with his rifle in case of any trouble, and they never returned. He presumed that they abandoned him. He also claimed that he was forced to leave the party to an unknown fate, and he had no idea where they went. He lived mainly on rosebuds and the occasional squirrel as he made his trek out. Preston thought it was odd and considered that Alfred looked rather well-fed and that it would be a fatal choice for 5 miners unfamiliar with Colorado to abandon their guide in the mountains, especially in an area where he said that he knew. Preston thought it was very strange that Israel would give Alfred his rifle, and that it would leave the group of 4 with only 1 rifle as means of a shooting game. So he also thought it was weird that Alfred had the skinning knife that belonged to Frank Miller, and this is when Preston started to press him about certain things, and that Alfred claimed that Frank stuck it in a tree and walked off. Having doubts about his story, this is when Preston was convinced that something nefarious happened. He also, heard and saw that Alfred, his bad behavior. He's a pathological liar, so all of his lies are finally catching up to him, and they're seeing it for what it's worth. And they know, based on his behavior leading up to when they arrived at Array's camp, there was accusations that flung in words that were exchanged, and Preston threatened to hang our lovely Alfred. Man. So meanwhile, back at the Los Pinos Indian Agency, 2 men of the 5-man party that had taken Gunnison River had been rescued by government cowhands. They were joined a few days later by the remaining 3 men, which included Oliver Lausenheiser, and the men were introduced to the head of the agency. His name is General Charles Adams, and he greeted them and relayed to them that they had already received another member named Alferd Packer. Now, and how Alfred had spoke of the desertion of the hands of his companion. All 5 of them discredited him and his staff, stating that the man that they had known would never abandon a man to die. Lautzenheiser flatly told the general that Alfred was not to be trusted and that he was sure to have something to do with whatever happened in the mountains. He noted that the Winchester rifle that Packard carried belonged to an elderly man in the Packers party, and that the pipe he had left behind at the agency belonged to a man named Shannon Bell, who was also part of the party. The men convinced the general to dispatch a mounted agency officer to retrieve Alfred for questioning, but under the guise of recruiting him for a search party for the missing men. So, upon arriving at the agency, Alfred came face to face with the general and the 5 men he had not seen since February. The agency officer came in after Alfred and relayed to the general that a man named Preston Nutter had told him that Packard had spent several dollars over his 6-week stay in Saguache, as well as buying a new horse and saddle, and that he was in possession of things that belonged to missing men. That he was penniless and he had originally joined their party. Lautzenheiser demanded that there was an explanation, that he needed to explain what happened to these men. Alfred, he didn't want to give anything to him. So General Adams told Alfred that if everything that Lautzenheiser is saying is true. And after a short while, like, basically that if everything he was saying was true, he would be guilty of all of his crimes. So, yeah. Basically, General Adams convened with a council of 5 miners, himself, Packer, and an agency officer to settle the matter. And as they began their proceedings, so basically, like, they wanted to find out what was happening. There was 2 Ute tribesmen that rushed into the agency and that was holding strips of dried human flesh, and they're referred to as white man's meat, which they had found on a hill near the agency while hunting. Now, Alfred fainted and he crumpled on the floor. He was revived and he started begging for mercy, swearing to make a full confession. And after a long silence, he then cryptically said to General Adams, it would not be the first time that people had been obliged to eat each other when they were hungry. Alfred then started crying, beginning to tell what was to become one of several different official statements over the next 3 decades. So, basically, in a nutshell, Alfred started killing them one by one, basically, and eating them because he was hungry. So he claimed that they left Ori's camp and what they had they thought was sufficient for their anticipated 14-day journey. Well, it wasn't. They survived for days on roots that were dug up from the ground, pine gum, rosebuds, and an occasional rabbit. After a few days of no wildlife, in the extreme cold, they were eating nothing but roots. He claimed that the men started to eye each other in an unsettling way, and their stomachs twisting with hunger. After a few days, he left the camp to gather firewood and returned to find 4 men around the body of Israel Swan, who had been struck on the head with a hatchet and killed. The 4 men then butchered Swan, and Alfred accepted the situation of joining them. Yeah. Basically, he turned it around saying that they started killing each other off one by one, and he was the sole survivor, which I think is a crock of shit. Yeah. So his first signed confession basically said that Old Man Swan died first. He was eaten by other 5 people about 10 days out of camp. 4 or 5 days afterwards, Humphreys died, was also eaten. He had about $133. I found a pocketbook and took the money. Sometimes afterwards, I was carrying wood. The butcher was killed, and the other 2 told me accidentally he was eaten. Bell shot California with Swan's gun, and I killed Bell. Shot him. I covered up the remains and took a large piece along. Then traveled 14 days into the agency. Bell wanted to kill me with his rifle, struck a tree, and broke his gun. Yeah. So they would discover the bodies. So they would discover them the following August, and they were stumbled upon by a man named John A. Randolph. He was an illustrator who worked for Harper's Weekly magazine. He discovered all 5 bodies at the foot of the Slumgullion Pass, which is 2 miles southeast of Lake City, Colorado. So in a pine-shaded gulch that's girded by hemlock trees, this is where he found the bodies. And they laid above Lake Fork of Gunnison River, which is now known as Dead Man's Gulch. They matched the description of the men that were with Packer. And Randolph also sketched the scene as he found it. Yep. So the coroner and law enforcement set out for the site with 20 volunteers to discover the body, and all 5 men were in various states of decomposition, all having been left to the elements and animals for months. The first responders noted that it appeared extreme violence had befallen on the men, and it was a putrid smell. Frank Miller's head was missing entirely from the campsite. His and Israel Swan's corpses had been considerably worked upon by scavengers, as there were little more than scattered bones. Israel's skull had a jagged chunk missing out of it, and it was presumed that Miller's head had been carried away by an animal. The bodies of George Noon and James Humphreys was largely flayed torsos with rotting viscera attached to skeletal legs, but with intact bearded faces, and Humphrey's face was slightly more decayed than Noon's. Shannon Bell lay with largely skeletal legs, splayed in his arms to his sides that were crudely cut. His remaining corpse was like the putrid mass of viscera encased in almost wholly flayed torso, um, which laid next to an almost still living, complete with a thick red beard in his bushy hair. So there was a lack of noticeable decay in his face, suggesting that he was the last one to die. So the top of Bell's skull had been ripped open, and his brains were laying on the ground beneath him. 3 men whose bodies were still intact or partially intact had flesh and muscle excised from choice and meaty locations, and no attempt had been made to consume bone marrow or any bones or any organs at all. So basically, they deduced that Alferd ate them. Yeah. People at this time were well acquainted with the story of the ill-fated Donner Party, which is another party that spent the winter of 1846 to 1847 in the Sierra Nevada, and they resorted to cannibalism. And obviously this happened 40 years later. Man. So cannibalism obviously is illegal. And basically it's murder. It's murder in order to obtain flesh to be consumed. So Alferd would be charged with murder. So on March 11th of 1883, Alferd was discovered in Cheyenne, Wyoming, living under the alias of John Schwartz, one of the original members of the Utah Mining Party who stayed with Chief Irway in the camp of 1874. So he was discovered by a man named Jean Cabazon, and he reported Packer to the local sheriff. He then apprehended him and contacted General Adams. So basically, this is fucking crazy. This whole thing is crazy. He had 2 different trials. He was charged with 40 years in prison, but only for the death of Shannon Bell, who was the only man that Packer continued to claim that he had killed, and the other deaths were beyond his control. Yeah. So he also requested to stand in his own defense, but that was denied. And he was sent to serve out his sentence at the Cannon City Penitentiary. He did receive parole. He did end up only serving 18 years of his 40-year sentence, and then he was released on parole. So he died April 23rd of 1907 at the age of 65 in Deer Creek, Jefferson County, Colorado. The cause of his death was dementia, trouble, and worry, although his clinical cause of death has been described as a stroke. He is widely rumored to have become a vegetarian before his death and was reported to by those who knew him as a man with rich stories and was well liked by children, which is fucking gross. He did receive a military burial, and he has a veteran's tombstone listing his original regiment in 1862. Yeah, this case is fucking wild. This case is absolutely wild. So, like I said, this case was turned into a musical comedy film called Cannibal the Musical, and it's based loosely on his life, and his name is Juan Schwartz, which is like John Schwartz from The Man Who Turned Him In. There's also a Czech-American horror movie called Ravenous that's based on this. There is another movie adaptation called The Legend of Alferd Packer. And then there is a stage play called Alferd Packer the Musical. There's also a horror film called Devoured, The Legend of Alferd Packer. So that, my friends, is the story of Alferd Packer, or the Colorado Cannibal, who is absolutely disgusting, and they still use him in teachings to this day at George Washington University in their forensic science department. They still use this case as why? You know what I mean? Like, why? Why would you resort to that? Obviously, we know you're in the cold, but your body can survive, I think it's about like 14 days without water. But I mean, anywho. So that, my friends, is today's true crime case. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys in another video. Bye, guys.